day he left, I was still wearing a hospital bracelet. Not from surgery, not from an accident. From giving birth, 36 hours of labor, an emergency C-section, and a recovery room that smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee. My daughter was 4 days old. She was sleeping in the portable bassinet my mother had set up next to the pull-out couch in my childhood bedroom, and my husband's side of the bed, the hotel room we'd been sharing near the hospital, was empty by the time I woke up at 6 in the morning. He left a note on the nightstand. I still remember exactly what it said, not because I kept it, I didn't, but because some things you read when you're that raw just get burned into you. Vanessa, I can't do this. I know that's not what you want to hear. I'll call when I'm ready to talk. Archer. That was it, 14 words. No, I love you. No, I'm sorry. Not even his full name. I sat there in that hotel room holding that piece of paper for probably 10 minutes. My incision was still swollen. I couldn't stand up straight. I hadn't showered in 2 days. And the man I'd been married to for 3 years had just walked out on me and a 4-day-old infant, with 14 words and a dash before his name like he was signing off on an email. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because people always expect the tears, the collapse, the moment where you fall apart. I didn't. I folded the note in half, put it in my purse, called my mother, and asked her to come help me pack. My mother asked if I was okay. I said, "Can you just come?" She came. What nobody tells you about the weeks after a C-section is how much of your energy goes just to moving through a room. Standing up from a chair is a 10-second process. Laughing hurts. Sneezing feels like someone is tearing you open from the inside. I was doing all of that while also waking up every 2 to 3 hours to nurse, while also fielding calls from Archer's mother asking me not to make this into something dramatic, while also figuring out what the word separated meant for our joint checking account, our lease that had 4 months left on it, and our daughter who didn't have a pediatrician yet because we'd been planning to find one together after she was born. Archer didn't call for 11 days. When he did, I was sitting in my parents' kitchen eating leftover pasta because that's what you eat when you're 32 and your life has just come apart and your mother keeps making food. He said he needed space to figure out who he was. He said he'd been feeling trapped for a long time. He said he still cared about me, about us, but he needed to find himself first. I asked him if he'd met someone. He said no. I said, okay. And then I said, I'm going to need you to set up a direct deposit for child support by the end of the week or I'm calling a lawyer on Monday. There was a long pause. He said, I wasn't expecting you to be like this. I said, like what? He didn't answer. I finished my pasta after we hung up. My daughter made a small noise in the baby monitor on the counter, the soft, grunting kind that means she's about to wake up. I went to get her. Her name is Cecily. She had a full head of dark hair and these enormous eyes that looked up at me like I was the only thing in the world. I held her in the dim light of my old childhood bedroom and I thought, okay. So this is what we're doing now. Archer's father called me 6 weeks later. I want to be clear that I had not reached out to him. I hadn't spoken to him since the baby shower, where he'd shaken my hand and said something polite and forgettable about being excited to be a grandfather. His name is Conrad. He's the kind of man who wears a watch that costs more than most people's cars and doesn't seem to notice it. He builds a regional commercial real estate company over 40 years, the old-fashioned way. Handshakes and site visits, and knowing every contractor in a 200-mile radius by first name. He called on a Tuesday afternoon and said he'd heard what happened and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I said I had exactly as many minutes as he needed. He said he was sorry about how his son had handled things. He said it quietly, not the way people say sorry when they want credit for it, but the way people say it when they mean it and don't know what else to offer. I said, thank you. He said he'd been estranged from Archer for almost 5 years before Archer and I even met. I knew that, vaguely, the way you know things about your husband's family that he doesn't want to talk about, and that he tried to rebuild the relationship when we got married because he thought it might be his last chance. He said watching his son walk out on a woman 4 days after she gave birth told him everything he needed to know about whether that chance had been worth taking. I didn't say anything to that. He asked how Cecily was doing. I told him she was eating well and had just started smiling, probably gas, but still. He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him. He said, "That's what they said about Archer when he was a baby. Still not sure they were wrong." I laughed too. I didn't expect to. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. He said he had no agenda. He said the word agenda like a man who was used to people assuming he had one, and maybe wanted, just once, to say out loud that he didn't. I said yes. We met at a diner in the town where I grew up, which was 40 minutes from the city, but still close enough to Conrad's office that he didn't have to rearrange his whole day. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with black coffee and a legal pad with nothing written on it. I brought Cecily in her car seat because I didn't have anyone to watch her. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "She has the Whitfield eyes." I said I'd noticed. He said, "My mother had them too." We sat there for a while talking about nothing important, the neighborhood, the diner, whether the pie was any good. And then, slowly, we started talking about everything else. About what Archer had been like as a child. About the fallout between them 5 years ago, which had started over the business and ended over something worse, that Conrad didn't get into specifics about, but that I could read between the lines well enough. About what I was doing now, which was technically on maternity from my job as a contracts analyst at a mid-sized logistics company, and what I was going to do when leave ended, which I hadn't fully figured out. He asked what a contracts analyst actually did. I explained it. He listened in a way that told me he actually understood it, not just nodding to be polite. He said, "Have you ever done anything on the commercial side? Vendor contracts? Lease negotiations?" I said some. Mostly downstream work, but I'd handled a few direct vendor renegotiations. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, "I have a vendor situation that's been sitting on my desk for 3 months because my contracts person quit in February and I haven't replaced her yet. Would you be interested in taking a look at it? Not as a favor, as a consultant. I pay your rate, whatever you're charging." I said, "You don't know my rate." He said, "Then tell me and I'll tell you if it's reasonable." I told him. He said that was reasonable. I want to be honest about what I was thinking at this point, because I'd been asked by my sister, by my best friend, by eventually even my own mother, whether I had a plan, whether I walked into that diner with an agenda of my own. The truth is, not exactly. Not yet. I was 32 years old with a 2-month-old baby, a separated but not yet divorced status, a maternity leave that was ending in 6 weeks, and a joint checking account that Archer had stopped contributing to while his lawyer argued about the definition of financial support during separation. I was tired in a way that doesn't have a word for it. The kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes everything slightly gray. What I had was this. I had been a contracts analyst for 6 years. I was good at it. I was good at reading people too, at knowing when someone was leaving room in the language for something they weren't saying yet. Conrad Whitfield was leaving a lot of room. He missed his son, not the version of Archer who'd walked out on his wife and infant daughter, but the version he'd imagined his son might still become. He was looking at Cecily and seeing a second chance at something. I could feel it. And I wasn't going to manipulate that. I want to be clear about that too. But I also wasn't going to pretend I didn't see it. I took the consulting work. I drove 40 minutes to his office once a week with Cecily in a portable bassinet, and I sat across from his conference table and I fixed his vendor contracts. I found 3 clauses that were actively costing him money. I renegotiated a supply agreement that had been grandfathered in at 2019 rates. I saved his company somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 over the course of 4 months. At the end of those 4 months, he offered me a full-time position as his director of vendor relations. I asked for time to think about it. He said, "Of course." I went home and called my sister and said, "Something is happening and I don't know what to do about it." She said, "Are you talking about the job or the man?" I said, "The job." She said, "Okay, but also the man." I said, "He's my estranged father-in-law." She said, "Technically, almost ex-father-in-law." I said, "That doesn't make it less complicated." She said, "No, but it makes it interesting." I took the job. I want to be clear about what that looked like practically, because I think people fill in the blanks with whatever narrative is most satisfying to them. What it looked like was I dropped Cecily at daycare at 7:30 every morning and drove 40 minutes to an office building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old wood and printer ink. I sat at a desk that used to belong to Conrad's previous contracts manager, and I did my job. Conrad and I had lunch together sometimes, not always, maybe once a week, and we talked about work and occasionally about Cecily and occasionally about nothing in particular. He came to her 6-month checkup because I mentioned I was nervous about the vaccinations, and he asked if I wanted company, and I said yes, before I'd fully thought about whether that was a strange thing to say yes to. He held her while she cried after the shots. His hands were very steady. I thought about how different it was from anything I'd expected my life to look like at this point. Archer and I had finalized the divorce by then. It was relatively clean as these things go. He signed a parenting agreement that gave me primary custody, with him having every other weekend pending his getting settled. He'd moved to Portland. He called Cecily approximately once a month on FaceTime and seemed surprised every time she'd grown. He paid child support, not generously, but on time. And as far as I could tell, he had, in fact, found himself, or at least found an apartment with a roommate and a job at an architecture firm doing mostly residential work. I don't hate him. I want to say that plainly. Whatever he did to me in that hotel room, whatever he was or wasn't capable of being, he is Cecily's father, and she is going to have a relationship with him for the rest of her life. And I made a decision very early on to keep my feelings about Archer entirely separate from her experience of who her father is. That decision cost me something. I won't pretend it didn't, but it also freed up a lot of space in my chest for other things. Conrad had a board of directors, 5 people plus him. They met quarterly to review financials and strategic direction, and for the first year I worked there, I had nothing to do with them. Then Conrad asked me to present to them on a vendor consolidation strategy I'd been developing. He asked me to write the slides, make the case, answer their questions. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. Cecily was 14 months old by then, and I had gotten used to feeling competent at things, but this was different. These were people who'd known Conrad for decades. People who had watched Archer grow up. I walked into that boardroom and set up my laptop, and the first thing one of them said to me, a man named Foster, who had the energy of someone who'd never once been told he was wrong about anything, was, "You're the one Conrad keeps talking about," I said. "I hope what he says is accurate," Foster said. "He says you're the smartest hire he's made in 20 years, I said. "I'll have to try to stay that way then." The presentation went well. Not perfectly. One of the board members had a question about the Eastern region suppliers that I didn't have a complete answer for, and said so clearly and offered to follow up by end of week, which I did. But overall, well, Conrad caught my eye across the table afterward and gave me a small nod. It felt like something. Archer called me on a Thursday night in October, about 18 months after the divorce was finalized. Cecily was almost 2.5. She was in the other room watching a cartoon about a dog who solves mysteries, and I was making dinner. Actually making it, something with chicken and roasted vegetables. The kind of meal that means you finally stopped surviving on whatever is fast and started allowing yourself small domestic pleasures again. He said he wanted to talk about coming back. I said, "Coming back where?" He said, "To the area, to being more involved." A pause. "With everything." I said, "With Cecily?" He said, "Yes. And I've been doing a lot of thinking, Vanessa, about us. About what I threw away. I think I made a mistake." I turned the stove down. I said, "What changed?" He said he'd grown. He said therapy had helped him understand some things. He said Portland was fine, but it wasn't home. He said he missed Cecily every day, and this I actually believed. And he said he'd been an idiot, and he knew that, and he was asking me if there was any version of this where we could talk about it. I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. I said, "Does any part of this have to do with your father?" Long pause. He said, "I heard you're working for him." I said, "I've been working for him for almost 2 years." He said, I thought that might be something we could talk about too. There's been some discussion about the succession plan for the company, and I know I haven't been." I said, "I'm going to stop you there." He stopped. I said, "I'm happy for you to be more involved with Cecily. That's what she deserves, and I will always support that." But I need you to hear me very clearly. I am not a door. He said he didn't understand. I said, I'm not a door back into your father's life, or back into this family, or back into anything you walked away from. If you want a relationship with your daughter, I will help you build that. If you want a relationship with your father, you're going to have to do that yourself. But if you're coming back because you've heard there's something to come back to, something financial, something to do with the business, then I need you to find a different reason, because that one isn't going to work. He was quiet for a long time. He said, You've changed. I said, I had a baby at 32 with a 4-day-old hospital bracelet on my wrist and my husband's note on the nightstand. I think change was probably the appropriate response. He didn't have anything to say to that. He came back to the area in the spring. He followed through on that part. He got an apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house and started taking Cecily on Saturdays. To the park, to the children's museum, to the little cafe near his building that had cookies shaped like dinosaurs, which she was extremely serious about choosing carefully. She started to know him, started to look forward to Saturdays, started saying daddy with the easy confidence of a child who has no idea about the weight of a word. I'm glad about that. I'm going to keep being glad about it even when it's complicated, which it sometimes is. Archer and Conrad did eventually talk. I wasn't there for it. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is that Conrad told me about it the following Monday over coffee in his office. We still had that habit, the once-a-week coffee, long after it had stopped being a professional thing and become just a thing we did. And he said that it had been difficult and necessary, and that he wasn't sure what would come of it, but that he was glad it had happened. He said, He asked me why I hired you. I said, What did you tell him? Conrad turned his coffee cup in a small circle on his desk. He said, I told him the truth, that you were the best person for the job, that I would have hired you regardless. I said, And what did he say? Conrad said, He said he figured. Then he looked up at me and said, I think what he was really asking was whether I chose you over him. I said, Did you? He thought about that for a moment. He said, I chose Cecily. I've always been choosing Cecily. You just happened to come with her, and you happened to be exceptional. I looked at him across the desk. He looked back. There was something in that moment I didn't have language for, not romantic, or not only that, but something more structural, like a door fitting into a frame it was always meant for. I said, You know you're going to have to put something in writing eventually. The board has been asking about succession. He said, I know. I said, I'm not going to push you on it. He said, I know that too. It's one of the reasons I trust you. The board met in November to formally discuss the transition plan. I had been director of vendor relations for 2.5 years by then, but in the 6 months prior, Conrad had been quietly expanding my role, pulling me into strategic planning, having me sit in on leadership meetings, copying me on correspondence I hadn't previously been included on. I knew something was building. I waited. At the November meeting, he proposed creating a new executive position, Chief Operating Officer, reporting to him, with a defined succession pathway to president within 5 years. He proposed me for the role. Foster, the board member who told me I was the smartest hire Conrad had made in 20 years, was the first one to second the motion. It passed unanimously. Archer found out through his mother, who found out through someone who'd been at the meeting, in the way these things always spread in families that have been in the same town long enough. He called me that evening. Cecily was already asleep. I was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine that I was mostly just holding. He said congratulations, and he said it in a way that sounded mostly like he meant it. He said, I want you to know I don't. I'm not upset about it. I'm not going to make this into a thing. I said, I appreciate that. He said, she's going to have a good life. I said, she already does. There was a long pause. Not hostile, just long, the kind of pause where two people are sitting with everything that happened between them and trying to figure out what, if anything, there is left to say. He said, I didn't know what I had. I said, I know. He said, for what it's worth, I think my father does. I didn't answer that. Some things you let sit exactly where they land. I said goodnight. I hung up. I looked around my apartment, the one I'd moved into 8 months ago. The one with the good light in the kitchen and the yard that Cecily could eventually play in, and the second bedroom that still smelled like fresh paint. And I thought about the hotel room where I'd woken up alone with a 4-day-old baby and 14 words on a nightstand. I thought about how I'd folded that note in half. I thought about how I'd never unfolded it again. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. I've read enough comment sections to know that a woman who doesn't fall apart, who doesn't perform her grief loudly enough, who keeps her eyes open and her calculations running even when she's in pain, is going to get called things. Cold, calculating, a certain word that starts with G that I refuse to give weight to by repeating. But here's what I know. I did not manufacture the circumstances that brought Conrad Whitfield into my life. I did not trick him or deceive him or play a role for him. I showed up to his office every week with a baby in a bassinet, and I did excellent work, and I was honest with him in ways that his own son never had been. Whatever grew from that, grew from something real. And my daughter who chose her dinosaur cookie with great seriousness and called her grandfather Conrad every Saturday when we dropped her off for Sundays, who had the Whitfield eyes and her grandmother's laugh. And my stubbornness. She was not a pawn. She was never a pawn. She was just a person who deserved to know all the people who loved her. I sat on that couch until the wine was room temperature and the street outside had gone quiet. Then I rinsed the glass, turned off the lights, and went to check on her. She was sleeping with one arm thrown over her head, the way she always does, the way that makes her look like she's just fallen from the sky and landed, perfectly, exactly where she was supposed to be. I stood there in the doorway for a moment. I thought, yeah, this is what we're doing now. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.